There are moments in American political life when the room itself seems to understand what is about to happen before the people in it do. This was one of those moments. The date was a Tuesday in late spring. The television lights inside the Fox News studio were the particular shade of blue-white that makes everyone look either authoritative or exposed, depending on what they are carrying into the conversation. Kari Lake was carrying contempt. She had been carrying it for years, and she had learned through 3 Senate campaigns and 1,000 cable appearances that contempt, delivered with enough confidence and just enough of a smile, could pass for strength. She had built a brand on the premise that she was the smartest person any Democrat had ever encountered, and that Democrats, by definition, had never encountered anyone who could hold that claim. She walked into that studio believing, with the serene certainty of someone who had never been seriously challenged, that tonight would be no different. She was wrong in a way that would take about 47 minutes to become fully visible to everyone watching, but it would become visible. Everything always does when someone has done the homework. Kari Lake had been brought in as a surrogate to discuss the administration's handling of federal housing policy. She arrived, according to sources in the production staff, 12 minutes early. She ordered water. She asked the makeup artist whether she looked too polished, which was a question she had clearly asked many times before, because she rephrased it as, "I need to look like I just came from a real conversation with real Americans." Now, she spent the remaining time before the segment refreshing her phone, because the segment was going to include a Democratic congresswoman who had been inserted at the last moment, a detail that had reached Lake's team 45 minutes before air. Lake had reportedly said, and this was confirmed by 2 people present in the green room. Which one? When told it was Jasmine Crockett, she had smiled. Not a large smile, a small, precise one, the kind of smile that is actually a dismissal wearing polite clothing. "Fine," she had said. "That's fine." And she had gone back to her phone. Jasmine Crockett arrived 7 minutes before the segment. She was carrying a leather folder. It was dark blue and it was not thin. She did not ask about lighting. She did not ask about water. She sat in the makeup chair and responded to 2 text messages, and then she set the folder on her knee and she did not look at it again, because she did not need to. She already knew what was inside it. She had been building what was inside it for 11 days. The segment opened with a question about federal housing voucher funding. Kari Lake took the question and expanded it, which was what she always did, because a question about housing policy was really, she explained, a question about the character of the Democratic Party, which had spent 50 years promising housing to communities of color and delivering nothing but dependency and failed bureaucracy. She was warm when she said this, practiced. She had said some version of it at least 200 times. She looked at Jasmine Crockett exactly once during this opening statement, and the look was the kind that is worse than not looking at all. It was the look of someone noting the presence of an obstacle they intend to drive around. "I know my colleague has strong opinions," Lake said, "and I always respect passion even when it's not backed by much else." She touched her lapel and turned back to the host. There was a sound in the studio. It was the sound of the room deciding what kind of conversation this was going to be. Jasmine Crockett heard it. She opened her folder, turned to a tabbed section and placed her hand flat on the page. She did not speak yet. She waited, loading, as it were, the weapon. The host asked Crockett for her response to Lake's framing of Democratic housing policy. What Crockett said, in that particular measured cadence that she had developed over years in Texas courts before she ever came to Congress, was this: "I appreciate the passion too. Let's look at what the numbers actually show." That was all. For the moment, that was all. Lake's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A very small adjustment, the kind that cameras catch and faces try not to make, like a chess player who has just noticed their opponent's hand moving toward a piece they had not expected. Crockett had not matched her energy. She had not risen to the implied insult about passion without substance. She had simply introduced the word numbers, and she had said it the way a surgeon says incision, quietly, clinically, with the full understanding of what comes next. What came next was the first folder section. The folder, it turned out, contained a documented analysis of federal housing voucher utilization rates across 14 states between 2017 and 2023. This was not opinion. This was not partisan framing. This was a Government Accountability Office report filed under reference number GAO 23105413, and it showed, in tables that Crockett had highlighted in 3 separate colors, that in the 7 states with Republican-controlled legislatures during that period, housing voucher utilization rates had declined by an average of 22.4%. In the same period, in states with Democratic legislative majorities, utilization had increased by 17.8%. She placed the highlighted page on the desk between them. She placed it gently, the way you place something that does not need to be thrown to land with full force. Lake looked at it. The host looked at it. "This is the GAO report from March of last year," Crockett said. "Not my numbers. Their numbers." She turned to Lake. "Would you like a moment to review which states are in which column?" Lake said she did not need a moment. She said the GAO report was a product of a bureaucracy that had been compromised by decades of progressive capture, a phrase she had clearly prepared. She said that real Americans were not living in GAO reports. They were living in communities that democratic policies had devastated. She said the word devastated with genuine conviction, and in the studio for approximately 3 seconds, it sounded like the statement of someone who was winning the argument. Those 3 seconds ended when Crockett said, "Let's talk about Texas," because Texas was in the report. Texas was in column B, the column showing declined utilization, and Texas had been governed at the state level by Republicans for 29 consecutive years. She turned to the page. She read the figure: 31.2% decline in voucher utilization in Texas between 2017 and 2023, against a backdrop of population growth of 15.9% in the same period. More people, fewer vouchers reaching them. She put her finger on the number. "That's not my math," she said. "That's the state auditor's math." Filed October 14th, 2023. The silence that followed was not complete. There was a soft sound from the production floor, but it was the closest thing to complete silence that a live television studio produces, and it lasted for 8 seconds. 8 seconds. The host appeared to be deciding whether to intervene. Lake was looking at the document with the expression of someone who has been handed a map they do not recognize. 8 seconds. Then Lake said, "I'd want to see the full methodology before I accepted any of that." And she said it with admirable smoothness, but the smoothness itself was the tell, because people who have good answers do not reach for methodology objections. They reach for the answer. Crockett simply nodded. "That's fair," she said. "The methodology is on page 34. I have a copy for you." She slid a second document across the desk. It was already tabbed. This was the moment that several commentators would later identify as the turn, not because of anything dramatic, because of what it demonstrated about preparation. One person in that studio had spent 11 days with these documents. One person had not known 45 minutes before air who they would be sitting across from. The room understood this. The cameras understood this. And Lake, for the first time, appeared to understand it too, though she gave no outward sign beyond a nearly imperceptible stiffening at the collar, the physical equivalent of a system rerouting. The second folder section opened with a name, not a statistic, a name: Darlene Whitmore, 63 years old, a retired school aide from Lubbock, Texas, who had applied for a Section 8 housing voucher in August of 2019. Her application had been confirmed received. Her place on the wait list had been documented. She had been assigned case number TX0441-2019-8817, and she had waited. She had waited through 2020, through a pandemic that had cost her the part-time job she had taken after retirement to supplement her fixed income. She had waited through 2021 when her landlord had raised her rent by $340 a month. She had waited through 2022 when her daughter had moved back home with 2 children to help share costs. Her name had reached the top of the wait list in March of 2023, at which point she had been informed that the program had been administratively suspended pending a state budget review. She was currently still waiting. Her case number remained active. Her circumstances had become considerably more difficult. Crockett read this not from memory but from a single printed page, and she read it slowly in the manner of someone who understands that some information needs room around it to land with full weight. When she finished, she looked up. "Darlene Whitmore asked me," Crockett said, "to make sure her case number was said out loud in a public place at least once. TX0441 2019 8817. She closed that section of the folder. That's what a waitlist looks like when it's managed as a budget line instead of a human obligation. Lake said something about individual cases being tragic but not representative. She said it carefully and she chose the word tragic, which was the correct word, but the sentence around it was doing political work trying to contain the case of Darlene Whitmore inside an acceptable category of unfortunate exception. Crockett let her finish. Then she said, Darlene isn't an exception. She's a data point. Specifically, she's one of 287,000 data points. She opened a third tabbed section, a HUD internal report, January 2024, showing 287,000 active housing voucher applications in administrative suspension across 11 states, 8 of which had Republican-controlled legislatures. She placed this document alongside the first. The desk was becoming a record. 287,000 Darlenes, Crockett said, and she said it without drama, which was precisely why it landed with so much. Lake shifted in her seat. It was a small movement, the kind that happens not from physical discomfort, but from the particular discomfort of recognizing that the terrain has changed without one having noticed it changing. She attempted a pivot. She said the real question was about federal versus state responsibility, that the Democratic Party consistently confused the two, that Crockett herself had been in Congress for 2 years, and what had she authored specifically to address this issue. It was a competent pivot. Under other circumstances it might have worked, but Crockett's folder had a fourth tab, and behind that tab was a 6-page document that was, specifically, the text of House Resolution 44-117, introduced March 7th of the previous year by Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas's 30th Congressional District. The resolution proposed a federal administrative reform requiring that housing vouchers reaching waitlist top status could not be administratively suspended without a 90-day public notice period and an individual written notification to each affected applicant. It had 43 co-sponsors. It was currently sitting in the House Rules Committee. She placed this document on the desk. "You asked what I've authored," she said. She tapped the cover page once. "This is what I authored. As of today, it has 43 co-sponsors and it's been in rules for 11 months. She looked at Lake. "You might ask your colleagues on the Rules Committee why it hasn't moved." Her voice did not change temperature by a single degree when she said this. The room was quiet again. 12 seconds this time. 12 seconds in which the only sound was something mechanical from the production area and a very faint sound from the audience section and nothing at all from Carrie Lake, who was looking at the document the way people look at things they have not prepared to see. 12 seconds. The host said something about taking a break and Lake said over him that the bill was clearly a political document designed to create a narrative rather than solve a problem. And Crockett said quietly enough that the host had to lean slightly forward. "There are 287,000 people on administrative suspension who might have a different description of what solving a problem looks like." The break was called. What happened during the commercial break was later described by 3 separate production staff members. Lake had asked her producer whether all of that had been pre-cleared with the booking team, meaning the documents, the report references, the specific case number. The producer had said that they had not been specifically pre-cleared because surrogates typically did not submit materials in advance of the segment. Lake had said, not loudly but with a precision that suggested the sentence had been composed carefully, "She brought documents." The producer had confirmed this. Lake had then said nothing further and had looked at the studio door for approximately 20 seconds before turning back to the desk. Crockett had not moved from her seat during the break. She had made 2 small notations in pencil at the edge of a page. She had taken a single sip of water. She had not looked at Lake. The second half of the segment opened with a question from the host about what the federal government should do in the next 12 months specifically. Lake answered first, and her answer was fluent and structured, and it contained 4 specific policy proposals, all of which had been part of her standard housing policy talking points for the previous 18 months. She delivered them well. She sounded for these 2 or 3 minutes like someone who had recovered equilibrium and intended to finish the conversation on different terms. Crockett made a note in the margin of her folder during this section. One note. When the host turned to her, she said 3 of those 4 proposals are already in HR 4417. The fourth, the market rate deregulation piece, has a 23-year documented track record, and it consistently produces increased unit costs and decreased affordability in the lowest income quartile. That's not opinion. That's the National Bureau of Economic Research Working Paper 31847 published last September. She did not have the paper with her. She did not need to. She had the citation, she had the finding, and she had the tone of someone for whom these numbers are not weapons deployed in a debate, but simply facts that have been sitting in the record waiting to be used correctly. If you'd like the full paper, she said to the host, I'm happy to provide it. Lake said that academic research was one thing and real-world experience was another, and she described a conversation she had had with a home builder in Phoenix who had told her that regulation was the single greatest barrier to housing development. It was a warm story. It was told with the practiced familiarity of a story told many times before. And when it concluded, Crockett said, I'd like to ask you a direct question. Lake said she welcomed it. In the states where your party controls the legislature, Crockett said, and where GAO documents are 4% average decline in housing voucher utilization over 6 years. Is there a single example, one state, one program, one documented outcome, where the approach your home builder in Phoenix described produced measurable improvement in housing access for families in the bottom income quartile? She put her pen down on the folder. One example, documented. I'm not asking for an opinion. I'm asking for a receipt. And the silence that followed was the longest of the evening. It was not a conversational pause. It was not a moment of collection. It was the silence of a question that has no good answer regardless of what is said, because a yes requires documentation that does not exist, and a no confirms everything that has been documented in the previous 40 minutes. Lake's jaw moved slightly. Her hand, which had been resting open on the desk, closed. Her eyes went briefly to the left toward the production area and then returned. The host appeared to have decided not to interrupt. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The sound from the production area was gone. Someone in the far row of seating had stopped typing. 20 seconds. Lake said, I think the framing of the question is designed to be unanswerable. 23 seconds after the question was asked. And Crockett said evenly and without any alteration in expression whatsoever, the framing is a documented government report and a yes-no question. If the honest answer is no, that's a data point too. Lake said that she was not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who had been in Congress for 2 years about housing policy that she had been working on for 2 decades in Arizona. She said it with genuine heat, and the heat was audible, and it was the first unmanaged sound of the evening from her side of the desk. Her voice had moved approximately half a register higher than it had been at the start of the segment. Her hand, which had closed, was now pressed flat against the surface of the desk. Crockett looked at her without urgency. She let the statement settle. Then she said, You've been working on Arizona housing policy for 2 decades. She said it without inflection. Arizona currently ranks 47th in housing affordability for renter households with incomes below $35,000, according to the Arizona Department of Housing fiscal year 2023. She opened one final tabbed section which had been behind all the others, which the camera briefly captured as she turned to it, a single printed page with a state seal at the top. She did not read from it at length. She simply placed it face up on the desk and she said, 2 decades is a long time to produce a 47th place ranking. She closed the folder. What followed was not technically a breakdown. It was something more controlled and therefore more revealing than a breakdown. Lake gathered herself. She said something about selective data and weaponized statistics and the Democratic Party's long history of using metrics to obscure a deeper moral failure. She said it with structure. She said it with composure. But the composure was scaffolding, and the scaffolding was visible in ways it had not been at the start of the segment. The particular quality of authority that she had brought into the studio, the certainty, the smallness of that initial smile, the look that had assessed and dismissed all of it, had changed into something that required maintenance. And things that require maintenance are not the same as things that are simply true. When the segment concluded, the host thanked both guests. Lake said it had been a good conversation. She said it first, which is what people say first when they need to have the last definition of a conversation before the room provides its own. Crockett said, "Thank you," and she closed her folder and she picked it up and she stood, and she was still standing with the folder under her arm when the lights changed for the cutaway. On the studio monitor in the production room, one of the staff was later reported to have said nothing, but to have looked at the monitor for a long moment before going back to their console. The segment was already being clipped. It would be clipped in 5 places: the GAO document moment, the Darlene Whitmore case number, the HR 4417 placement, the 23-second silence, and the final line about 2 decades and 47th place. Each of those 5 moments was a complete thought, a complete emotional package, requiring no surrounding context to communicate exactly what had happened in that studio. What had happened in that studio was this. A woman had walked in with contempt as her primary tool, and contempt had met documentation, and documentation had won, as it always does when someone has been willing to spend 11 days building it. Kari Lake had walked in expecting to drive around an obstacle. The obstacle had brought a folder. The folder had contained a GAO report, a HUD analysis, a case number belonging to a 63-year-old woman in Lubbock who was still waiting, a piece of legislation with 43 co-sponsors, a state housing ranking, and a yes-no question with no good answer. None of it had been delivered with anger. None of it had been delivered with triumph. It had been delivered with the particular quality that this audience, these millions of Americans who have spent years being told to doubt their own eyes, most urgently needs to see. The quality of someone who did the homework, who had the receipts, and who understood, with complete certainty before the lights came up, exactly how the conversation was going to go. At the start of the segment, Kari Lake had said with that small, precise smile that she always respected passion even when it wasn't backed by much else. At the end, Jasmine Crockett picked up her folder and walked out. She left the documents on the desk. She did not need them anymore. They had done what documents do when they are used correctly. They had told the truth without asking anyone's permission in a room that had no choice but to canfi orent re-ganchilaf ki-achinan tiukus. End of script, 3,800 words.